Hi, everyone. Welcome to this NYU journalism event on Zoom. We have Phoebe Unter and Nicole Kelly, right now producers of the Heart podcast. To introduce them, I'm going to read the co-bio that Phoebe sent me this morning. After meeting at a clothing optional house party in Mexico City, Phoebe Unter and Nicole Kelly became the co-hosts of Bitch Face, an audio zine. NK and Phoebe have also collaborated on other happenings and projects like Cunt Power, Dyke Ranch, a temporary lesbian separatist retreat during the rage-filled summer of 2016, Triage, a publication and pop-up clinic in response to late-stage capitalism, and zines, including Solidarity is Still for White Women and You Are Not an Intersectional Feminist. Welcome, Phoebe and Nicole. We're so happy to have you. I wanted to just kind of step back to begin. Like, how did you each begin working in radio, and how did your collaboration originate?
I had gone to journalism school in undergrad, and then I kind of became disillusioned with journalism, and I had switched to doing more like visual art stuff. And then when NK and I started making Bitch Face, that was kind of realizing that audio was something that I could do and wanted to do. And then Bitch Face ended up kind of being my reemergence into journalism. And while doing that, I've also worked like in public radio a little bit. And then now, the Heart.
What about you, Nicole?
I guess I also came to radio from being disillusioned with literary publishing. Like I was writing like literary fiction and got an MFA and was like teaching creative writing, and like kind of thought that was what I was going to do, but just kind of became annoyed with kind of like the gatekeeping aspects of that industry and how long it took to do things and how much marketing dictated like your sort of success as a writer. So I guess like around the time I met Phoebe, I just moved back to LA and had a lot of odd jobs and I was driving around a lot and I was listening to NPR a lot. I think I was just interested I remember telling Phoebe like I'm interested in like learning how to interview. And so when Phoebe was approached by some people who were editing a literary journal that I had published in and asked her to host the podcast, I kind of like elbowed my way in to be the co-host.
NK was on the top of my list of people I would want to co-host a podcast with, and then it just kind of got to happen. It's true. Yeah. I could pull up that note in my phone from 2015.
And so can you just explain, because people are familiar with the Heart, but might not be with Bitch Face. So can you explain like what is Bitch Face? What's your mission with that project?
It was meant to be like the podcast companion to this literary journal called Selfish. And I feel like the first episode we were kind of like, it's going to be like a feminist magazine format or whatever. Just over time, I think as Phoebe and I got to like know each other and started to also like we said, collaborate on other kinds of things outside of audio, it really changed kind of like the political direction of Bitch Face. And then also at the same time, at a certain point, Phoebe started taking on like more of the production and like really kind of, I feel like blossomed as a producer. And like that was I feel like that's when our collaboration began. But I was like, oh shit, like Phoebe can like really do some cool sound design things. And much later I started sound designing as well. But
yeah, it was very much like self-taught. I feel like originally we just wanted to make something that we wanted to hear. Every episode we were like trying something new. And over time, we like started to sort of like do things for the podcast and kind of like switched it into sort of somehow documenting like what we were thinking about, what we were reading, what we were into, what we were like trying out in life. And also making a lot of work about like artists that we were into and admired.
I feel like now it kind of exists as like a portfolio because it is so different and because we didn't really make it in a super consistent way. It's more like, I think there are like 10 episodes that exist that were made over 3 years or so.
Yeah. Some of it holds up. It's raw too.
Some of it documents a time.
I mean, it's interesting the way the two of you kind of have different backgrounds. Like Phoebe's coming from more of like you went to journalism school. That's your background. Nicole, you're coming more from like creative writing. How do those two kind of lenses meet? Like, how do they interact together?
It's kind of funny because you were saying when we started just kind of off on our own doing our thing, I think at the beginning we were like trying to do radio in this particular way. And we were like working with someone who had done more radio. But once it was just us, I feel like we really naturally fell into like NK, like can just like sit down and write a script, and then we like go back and work on it together, and like I'll like rewrite parts sort of in my voice. She's really good at like writing big arcs for the episode, and I kind of took on dealing with the tape.
But we also would do interviews frequently together, and I did feel like, because I didn't, in the beginning, I didn't have any experience with production, and like I was more just like, I'm the host and like you're the producer. Like we both were hosting, but it was more like Phoebe did the production at first.
And that was great for interviews. Yeah. Because NK is great at asking questions.
Like I felt the presence of your journalistic training, and I think I really had a lot of like respect for journalism. And then we started going to like Allied Media Conference together and meeting a lot of like liberation journalists. And I think that also increased my interest in like sort of reporting and like what reporting could be. I think both our visual art, Phoebe's visual arts background and my creative writing background really inform like the way that like with Bitch Face and with The Heart, like the formats are all really different. Kind of like fluidity that we felt with regards to the form of the episodes, I think. So it was kind of like some journalistic skills, but then put into this container that was way more informed by like creative writing. Or I feel like your visual arts background really informs like how you, I imagine it must inform how you sound design. Like I feel like you always, that's like what you often would bring to my sort of structural ideas, is like really cool ways to like kind of animate it.
And I do feel like when I'm editing tape, I'm like a Photoshop native. That's like my first kind of like editing program. And so I'm often like trying to do things that I can do in Photoshop with sound that don't always exist, but I'm like try to do that, or like think of it in like layers, or think of it in these ways that there's like tools that exist for making digital images.
Let's talk about your recent series. What were your goals with Race Trader and divesting from people pleasing?
My goals for divesting were like first and foremost sort of selfish. Like I really felt like when the timing of when Caitlin approached us to make The Heart, I was already writing that series and didn't really know necessarily. I think I wasn't sure if it would be like a written project or an audio project. It was the kind of thing where I felt like I really can't work on anything else except this right now. Like it was really just consuming all of my creative energy. And I really wanted to like document what I had just learned and what I was continuing to learn about mental health, and kind of like the way that emotion is processed, the way that like trauma lives in the body, the way that you can sort of unlearn certain things on a sort of emotional neurological level. Like I had just learned a bunch of things that I felt like were that my mind was kind of blown. And I really wanted to share that with Black femmes in particular who might have similar experiences to me. Along the way, it also just became a way of me like documenting like that version of myself that was like that feels very much in the past. Like by the time I finished, I was like, that is no longer who I am or how I'm living my life. I think I wanted to like almost like honor that self and kind of like the different great tools and like maladaptive tools that I had like developed to kind of deal with growing up in white supremacy culture, essentially.
And like, what kind of impact are you hoping that the series has?
When the series was coming out, I did hear from like other, not only Black women, but a lot of younger Black women who I think were identified with like kind of the sort of like inner voice that I'm talking about, and had never really heard it expressed before. And I really feel gratified when people say like, oh, I thought that I was really the only one who had ever had those kinds of thoughts, and then we can kind of talk about it. And I love like sharing some of the tools that I did use to kind of like work through that some of which are referenced in the series and some of which are not. I think I also just felt like when I started, I know that I was thinking a lot about vulnerability as like a political practice and tool. Some of the things that I was doing to kind of like work through my own individual stuff were done in very collective, very like queer and POC spaces. And I was really thinking a lot about just like the value of vulnerability. Like when people learn vulnerability, people learn that it just kind of helps you, I think, like build better relationships, helps you sort of like heal certain kinds of things that maybe you've learned like in your families. Which ultimately, I guess, like my idea was like having better relationships would ultimately lead to like stronger movements, like stronger communities, that kind of thing. And I was thinking as well about vulnerability's relationship to like accountability, or I was thinking about shame's relationship to accountability, and kind of noticing that like if one can't be vulnerable and kind of confront the things that we're ashamed about, or the ways that we can be stymied by shame, and how that kind of prevents a certain level of accountability. And how that kind of does the opposite of what I said. Like it kind of prevents people from forming like deep connections or real intimate bonds, which is something that I think like Phoebe and I had done a lot of work in Bitch Face about like intimacy and kind of like wanting to go deeper into that. And so just kind of like wanting to kind of like raise those ideas, I think, and just kind of, I think I just hoped it would be sort of like something that would engender conversation, whether people are really related to like my story or not.
it's so great to hear that like you got the feedback back from people, because I know that that's sometimes something that happens. Like you put something out in the world and it's like, like how are people receiving this?
Yeah.
But I'm really glad to hear that people were in touch with you.
Well, just that was one of the things I love about audio. I think when I was writing fiction, like that is exactly how you just sort of send something into the void and then you never have any idea like who's reading it or if anyone read it or if anyone cared. And it is cool to feel like with radio that you're kind of in a conversation with an audience, especially an audience like The Heart. Like I think a lot of people reached out about both of the series.
So Phoebe, what about you? Like talk about kind of like what you were trying to do with Race Trader.
I'll start and like work backward, because like the feedback, I mean, I was surprised to get like several emails from people who were like, I want to give away my white parents' house. Like, how do I do that? It's funny because when I started that series, like I had all these kind of like really lofty things. I was like, I want white people to dismantle white supremacy. Like, I want to be part of that. Like, I want to believe that that's possible. Like, I want to be part of a community of people that are doing that. This was like my first time making anything really personal work. And I was working with an editor, Sharon Mashihi, who was like, you need like a small goal, like something attainable, like within this series. And that was like kind of difficult for me to come up with. Because I think originally also when Caitlin reached out and was like, what are you guys working on? Like I had been working on something that vaguely connected to all of this, but it was like kind of a lot bigger and more like about like different generations of my family and kind of like the pendulum for Jews of like between like white supremacy and racial solidarity and different stuff like that is like in the works and probably will be for a long time. But I remember at one point NK was kind of like, we were talking about that idea of vulnerability and kind of like, can you just make something that sort of shows like what is going on for you as a white person who's thinking about these things. And so I did that kind of became like the sort of like micro goal of the series. And then also like in sort of like confronting these things in myself, it evolved to like involve other people. Like I feel like it kind of builds to these conversations with my family and looking within myself and how like I can't really do that without interrogating the things that I've kind of like inherited as a white person.
I really like what Sharon said to you. Like, okay, like let's have like a goal that we can explore in this series. Because this is something I talk to my students about a lot. You can't do everything with your story. Dismantling white supremacy is a really big goal for a radio series, right?
I mean, yeah. I mean, part of it, I think, is like trying to create a world where like that is like where you can at least like play around with the ideas. Like, what if people were like doing this thing differently? Like, what if like my parents and all their neighbors were like, we're gonna just like leave this neighborhood because our housing values have gone up as a result of like white supremacist policies. And like, I do wish that people were more creative and thought of different ways that they could make material change. But yeah, it was big. And I feel like Sharon was always like, that's cool, but what about you? And really pushed me to like have it be more like within my subjectivity.
It's interesting to sort of hear you talk and realize that you didn't necessarily go into this series being like, I'm going to make a story, like I'm going to interview my parents about this. Like that evolved through the process.
I feel like because I hadn't been really like stewing on this for a long time, and it did kind of like start, and I was like, okay, I'm doing this, and it kind of grew out of that. Like sometimes I wish that I had more of like a story in mind before starting this, because it was hectic to like figure it out as I went along. It is hard to be sort of like making something about something that is like very much present or in like the very recent past, as opposed to like something that has sort of completed and I've had time to like really ruminate on like the meaning of all the parts.
I really like radio stories where I'm hearing people go through something in the like live, you know, like they're processing it in front of the microphone. So that's something I really liked about both of your series. Something that you both brought up is like you have a lot of ideas. I understand that like you both read a lot. You know, there was like a reading list with your podcast. You both like theory, but you know, like theory and like doesn't always make for great radio. So I'm hoping you can talk about like how do you have these big ideas that you're like working through and you're thinking about, but just how do you translate that into an actual story or series?
I think it's sort of what Phoebe touched on. It's kind of like kind of always trying to bring it back to like your own subjectivity and experience. I just like kind of thought through like all the different kinds of theory we've talked about with Bitch Face and this story. I also feel like Phoebe like Racier incorporates a lot more theory than I attempted to do with divesting. But
well, but we both also cut a lot. Like
yeah,
we were instructed, because making the heart is like not just kind of making whatever we want. Like there is like a kind of an audience, and there's like a way that things are done that we did get to like kind of meld and shift. But I feel like it was like that those were like the most heavily scrutinized things on the chopping block, were like when we were trying to like just sort of add in like, I read this thing, and it, because like I feel like that's not thought of in a traditional sense as like something that like happened to the character in the story.
Yeah, you're right.
Which I think is hard, because I'm like, it like I feel like we, especially in our friendship and our collaboration, like we're very informed by things we read. It like I definitely feel like something happened to me when I read certain things.
I feel like we can mark time in our relationship, and I'm sure in our lives, by like, oh, we had read this thing, and that clearly informs everything we were doing in our life.
Like the uses of the erotic period, like the different times, and a lot of that most of that probably did get cut, and it was helpful to kind of think of like what is like the story, and then what is like the greater scaffolding around the story that like is like this kind of bookshelf full of experiences and things we've read and things we've seen and all of that, and how like kind of being like, oh, that doesn't all have to be in the story. Like sometimes you take it out and you're like, I didn't even notice, like it's fine without it.
I definitely at a certain point was like, okay, I'm just going to I'll know that those things are the subtext, and perhaps other people might pick up on those things, but I'll just like let it be the subtext and not explicitly name it at every opportunity.
Yeah.
I'm also down though for when you say like it doesn't make great radio. Like I know that is like a little bit of a contested thing. What is great radio? And I'm like, I'm down to hear more radio where people are like, I mean, there was like an episode of Shortcuts that was like people's relationships to certain texts, which was kind of cool. I know like sometimes that's a thing, and some of those are cool and some of them are boring. Like sometimes I'm like, that text doesn't do it for me, but I would be down to hear more like great radio that grapples with theory in an interesting way.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think it's just like an extra challenge to kind of do it creatively. Something I found so interesting about this work, particularly in your series, Nicole, is like, how do you capture an emotional state in audio? Like I'm thinking about, there are parts in your series where we really kind of get a sense of like what's going through your head, and like the voices in your head. And
I guess in the first episode of Divesting, I lead with me talking about what I felt was like the most superficial layer of it all, which was like, I'm a person with anxiety, and here's what that anxiety sounds like. And I really did want to convey that feeling as best I could. I guess like the way that I made that episode was that at a certain point, like I said, I was writing the series and I was like, I want to do something with the things that I'm thinking about and learning. And so I was writing a lot. I was also like leaving myself a lot of voice memos, which I don't think any of them actually made it into the series. But the way that I like made that first episode, for example, was we had this like day with Caitlin where Caitlin was explaining to us her process of producing narrative documentary. Here's when I'm interviewing, like here's what I sort of do, here's kind of like the steps I'll take, and here are the questions I would ask. We had never set out to do narrative with Bitch Face. We were kind of just doing we just were making kind of like essays, I guess you would say. But that day I went home and I kind of interviewed myself with the steps that she had given us. I was home alone and I was like, I'm just gonna like try to tell the story that I think, whatever I think the story is, I'll just say it into the mic. And I kind of thought like this will be my first draft, and from this I will write what comes next. I was able to kind of like tap into like those feelings really well. And so we wound up just, a lot of the tape that you hear is just me kind of almost like having like an out of body experience where I'm kind of just saying like, here's what's going on, and being really honest because I didn't think I would use it. It's kind of cut up in the episode, but like the last 3 minutes, for example, like was the last 3 minutes of the first draft. And I think I really liked how it sounded. I really thought it was effective in the way that I had hoped it would be. You are kind of just hearing me privately confess to whoever, myself, like my audio diary kind of thing. The second episode is a lot more written, and I think that really just comes from my creative writing background, where in the second episode I was talking about feelings that were a lot less immediate, and some of the more personal parts were things I had written about in fiction before. Those episodes, I think I was more able to sort of think of myself as a character and then write from the point of view of the characters. Like I have practiced kind of like writing in like, writing in the first person, writing even in the close third person, where you kind of are getting a character's interiority. And so the first one's a little bit more performative maybe, and then the second and third are maybe more like creative writing. I guess one thing I thought when I was like anticipating this question was thinking about how like advice that I was given as a radio person when I first started doing radio was when you're speaking to the mic, like imagine you're speaking to like 3 or 4 people standing in a corner at a party. Like I've heard that advice a couple of times. And I feel like this was more like I was imagining like I'm telling like one very trusted friend in a really private setting that then was broadcast to the world.
That's so interesting. So like there are parts where you hear kind of the voices in your head. There's that part where where you're remembering the time when you were with your mom in the store, talking through like what you were, or like in the background, you hear a little bit of like your voice as a teenager, I guess. So is that something that you developed just through the sound designing process?
Yeah. I think also a lot of like what would have been flaws in a different piece, I wound up incorporating because I felt like they really fit thematically, like different recordings that I made on different days. I really liked how they sounded when I layered them. And I liked the effect, like the fact that you just got the effect of child self, teenage self, present self. I felt like it really worked to kind of just convey that, like, because that's what I was sort of talking about, was kind of like your child self exists in your adult self, and the voices that you hear in your head are actually not from the external world. They actually are your own voice having internalized messages from the external world. So yeah, like again, kind of like what I said before, like in winding it, the fact that I wound up using that first draft, I think a lot of that happened in the first episode, especially, where I just kind of thought like, oh, this actually like really works for me. And I think that's also very bitch face. Like to me, like kind of, I felt like I sometimes will say, it feels weird to say, but I sometimes will say like, oh, I feel like kind of like our punk style is like making use of like your own limitations. Like the fact that I'm frankly like not that experienced as a producer. I'd only ever worked with Phoebe before I made the series. And so I also just felt like relying on like layering of voices, relying on my writing versus like, I can't really do as many technically advanced things as like Phoebe can do as a sound designer. And so I thought a lot more about like my voice and what I could do with my voice.
Oh, and I just want to back up for a second, because if people don't know who Caitlin is, who's been referenced a number of times. So Caitlin Prest was one of the founders of The Heart, along with Mitra Kaboli, and Caitlin is now the executive producer of The Heart, which is part of her production company called Mermaid Palace. How does it feel to make such intensely personal work? I mean, like Phoebe, like you going to your parents and having that intense conversation. I mean, just talk about that.
The first time I ever played some like family tape or whatever for other people, I like sat there and like cried. Also, I did like a crash course in sort of like narrative storytelling, like as I was beginning this process. And so like there were times when I could be like we would talk about it often as like the character, like kind of reminding that like this isn't just like you or your entirety. These are like very particular parts of your life that you're using to shape a narrative that doesn't really even need to be thought of as like your story all the time. But it also is. And so it was like scary for me at first to put things out in the world, especially because also when I learned sort of like basic narrative storytelling techniques of like the hero's journey and like the character wants something and they try these different things and then they get it, that really early on it was like, well, that's not really going to work in a story about someone trying to like divest from white supremacy culture as a white person. Like we're not really like rooting for that person. I mean, like in some ways, yes, like we want them to like succeed in learning so that they can like change and all of that, but like it wasn't about like seeming good or like cool or something. This character, me. And so I think I just had to like let go of a lot of that and kind of be like, this is going to be perceived in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. I think early on at one point Sharon said something, because I was like, ugh, does this like make me look like an asshole or something? And she was like, you can't worry about like those listeners that would be like judging you. The people that are like listening will be able to like take in what you're like the messages you're trying to have. Like those are the people you want to focus on. Like the people that will just like turn it off, don't worry about them.
What about you, Nicole?
I don't have a filter. Like I just feel like I don't really know like what is appropriate or inappropriate to share about myself sometimes. And I observe in life and with some of the things I make, people having like reactions that surprise me. I'm like, oh, maybe that's a weird thing to say. So there's that. I think while I was making it, I mostly just felt like, I also should say that Caitlin was not my editor. My editor was Chiquita Pascal, who's an amazing artist and producer, and also a Black woman. And I think making it with her was really wonderful because she was like, this has value to like, it wasn't just like, sometimes I'd be like, is this just like a navel gazing sort of project? Yeah. And she would remind me that it had value. And I think like me just thinking of like I said, like kind of like just imagining like a certain kind of profile of a young Black woman really helped me get over myself. But then, yeah, like now I feel like it's like, I don't always want to, I don't apply for jobs with divesting for people pleasing. I don't want to be someone's first impression of me. People, so there's a part of me that's sort of like, it's like out there. Like I've said a lot of stuff. Like I really revealed myself in a really serious way. And sometimes I feel a little bit like self-conscious about that. But I think I mostly feel like really liberated by it. And I have found with regards to just like how it is to like be a person who has put that out there, I think sometimes I've noticed when people do have like someone I met through a dating app, like I didn't tell her what podcast I worked for a while. And then her roommate was listening to Race Trader and shared Race Trader with her. So then she's like, oh, I heard Race Trader. And then I realized that's the podcast that you work on. And then I heard, just wanted to let you know I did hear divesting. But she seemed like really uncomfortable with like what she had heard. And it really was informative for me. I was kind of like, oh, like I can't really, it says a lot about your own relationship to vulnerability and intimacy if like you can't even have a conversation with the thing that I made. Like you feel embarrassed by what I made. It's helped me be really authentic going forward, I think. Right. But I'm also like excited to like, I really want to do like fictional things, and I'm working on a show that has like nothing to do with my personal life now. That also is really nice.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I like definitely felt re-traumatized at certain points, like revisiting some of those memories. And so I don't know if I can like endorse that.
I want to pivot to questions from some of the group. So Meg Duff says, I just interviewed two 12-year-old girls about their creative partnership / friendship.
Drop the link.
It made me curious if you have developed any creative routines together, or like how else you support each other in your work.
We made it the first episode of The Heart together, and we had this kind of like interesting writing process, I feel like, where we just like went away and then like kind of presented our writing back to each other in this way that was like fun. Like I feel like with you and Kay, I feel like safe to like share my writing or ideas, but I also like feel challenged, like I definitely think that you always like tell me exactly what you think, and it's often like that you're not into it, and no, it's very often that you are, but I'm just saying that like the trust in our like collaboration is like extremely useful for like making things both together and just like when I'm making something on my own.
I feel the same way. Like I trust that if something is bad, you will tell me, and I think that you have really high standards for the things that you consume, and so I trust that you're applying those standards to me and our collaborative work.
We have routines. We used to eat a lot of Domino's pizza.
Yeah.
We drink a lot. We smoke weed. I don't know.
We do a lot of like on a longer term, not like, with no sort of like official structure, but we do a lot of like check-ins. We'll have like quarterly or annual check-ins. Like, how is this collaboration going for you? Do you still want to be doing this? Like,
relationship talks are good. We love to, when we have the opportunity to like kind of go away and like be immersed. Like we had the chance to do that for like a week about a year ago, and that was like really great.
So here's a question. Could you share a little bit about Caitlin's interview process and more about you use / bend the conventional rules?
The process that she was explaining was more about like eliciting story from people who maybe aren't storytellers. And so I just sort of applied it to myself, which I'm sure changed a little bit. I mean, I guess like really quickly, like the thing she explained. Also, I would say that we mostly didn't use this. Phoebe and I did a lot of like deviating from Heart standards and practices over the course of the last year.
We got in trouble.
We did. Yeah, we were not good at following. We don't like authority. But the process that she has used is she said that she would just sort of like have someone just kind of sit, and I have used it. I did this recently with someone. So like you just kind of have them just ask really open-ended questions. It's kind of like a long pre-interview. Like you might do like a 1 to 2 hour conversation where they just tell you everything that comes to their mind, and you kind of just let them meander and just say whatever feels related to them. Like I guess from that first interview, you then decide like, here's what I think the narrative arc is. And then you kind of go back and get those beats. And then probably there's a third time where you're going back and getting like very granular and like perhaps even like telling people like, say this, like I need you to say this thing. I need you to say it in this way.
There were like those rules too of kind of like having people speak in the present, trying to like recount the story as if like they're in it, asking a lot of like sensory details and things like that.
Well, that's one of the instructions we definitely did not follow. But I also feel like I'm working on a show now that's like more newsy, but it's sometimes people recounting traumatic events. And I really don't want to ask someone like, put yourself in that experience again and tell me as if it's happening right now. I think that's kind of an irresponsible ask to make of people of color sometimes. I mean, anyone who's really experienced trauma, but like I really feel it's particularly sensitive about that, asking people of color to do that. I think white producers, straight producers, I think lots of people should really investigate like their positionality when like employing that particular set of, I don't know.
I feel like one thing that was cool in Bitch Face is that we often did these interviews. They were like very intuitive. I mean, we had questions we wanted to ask. We would like veer, you know, depending, really trying to meet like the person where they're at and then using that tape to like make something that reflects what they said versus being like, I need this story from you. In my 4th episode of Race Trader, I interviewed this person, Stephanie, and like we probably had like maybe like 6 like 4-hour conversations for what ended up being like, I don't know, 7 minutes or something. But like I felt like it was important because I was asking her to tell her life story to like be really present, just like receive sort of like what she wanted to say. And it was really hard to like direct her. But I would say like, yeah, the Caitlin method is like, it's not that it's like not a trauma. NK at one point was like, I'm a trauma informed reporter. And I was like, that's a really good way to put it. And not to say that Caitlin's method like isn't that, but it definitely is like story first versus like emotional relationship first or something.
I feel like as a producer, like I want to listen for both like where is the story, but also like what is the story according to this person. And I think sometimes even in editorial sessions, there would be a story that was suggested, and I would say like, well, I know I've talked to the person, so I know that that person is not interested in telling that story for various reasons.
I'm sure your editors loved that.
Yeah, no, I mean that's like it's such a fine line, and I guess I think of it very much as like a case by case basis, and you have to really be checking in with yourself and with the person that you're interviewing to know how deep to probe or what they're comfortable with. That's not to say that some people don't want to go deep and talk about these things either. It's just, it kind of depends, you know.
I also think NK mentioning positionality, like I definitely like pushed like obviously my mom in those interviews, like we were like fighting on the phone and I was like recording it. And like, I do think that there are times when like, I mean, I both would say like, as a white producer, I'm like interested in pushing white people a little bit on their like the views that they think, you know, are real or whatever. But also I'm like, there's aspects of interviewing my family and the power dynamics of that feel complicated to me. Like, it's kind of like, I only would have interviewed my mom like that, you know? And it's kind of like that produces kind of interesting tape, but people have been like, did that destroy your relationship? And luckily like, no, because we just fight all the time. But
I felt that way with even interviewing my own mother. Like I had a lot of questions about whether I was exploiting her or the relationship.
I was curious about this actually, Phoebe, like how it did impact your relationship with your mom, or was that just kind of like the way you interact all the time anyway?
Yeah, we have like screaming fights and then wake up the next morning. It's like, what do you want for breakfast? I love you. Like, it's like, that's just like happens to be our dynamic. And so it actually was pretty like true to our dynamic that like we would talk like that and it wasn't like lasting damage to our relationship, because people were like, did you fear retribution from your parents? And I was like, whoa, like but I understand for some people like that makes sense, that's how it would be. Well, I also didn't tell my grandma and I still feel weird about that. But
you didn't tell your grandma about this series?
Yeah, I didn't, because my sister is a fiction writer and writes about my grandma, and my grandma is like, there's been a lot of family controversy around my sister's writing. And so I was like trying to avoid that until I could like listen to it with her maybe and like talk through it, rather than just like her sitting in her house, like listening to this radio story.
One thing that came up when I was talking about this with my students, how did you decide to start so where you interview your parents about the house? You just jump right into the fighting.
I think that I liked that tape. Like I wanted to use that tape. And then I did kind of, for that episode, I kind of wanted to weave back and forth between like storytelling of this like multi-generational story, and then like the kind of real time, like I wanted people to kind of hold in their mind that this is like an active, ongoing thing that is happening between people, and then kind of like come in and explain the different backstories we're bringing into the conversation. I did those interviews over years with my family. What I had in mind for the arc was sort of like moving the needle a little bit with my parents and the types of discussions we were having. And so that was kind of like the A arc, and then the B arc was kind of like all the other stuff.
The two of you produced Bitch Face, and these two series, and I guess it's for 2020, you were the producers of The Heart. And now you're working on other projects and other shows. So how does your audience impact the way you tell your stories? Because like each, I know like Bitch Face had an audience that's a bit different from The Heart, and where you're working now is a different audience. So like, how does that inform your choices of storytelling?
I felt the presence of the audience when we started The Heart, that this had been an ongoing show and that there was something that Heart listeners were like looking for. And so like maybe like Bitch Face was like whatever we were both interested in that like held both of our interest, and that we were like, this feels juicy and we want to do this, like we would do it. And this felt like, oh, like even just like the way the story is told, there were parameters based on the audience. And also like for my show, for Race Trader, I also was kind of like, I felt like I had a sense of like who the Heart audience was, and that there were like probably a lot of like white listeners who were like maybe young and like engaged in politics. And so I was like sort of playing to that audience at times. Like I had envisioned sort of like audience A and audience B, and kind of like was like batting back and forth between like who I was speaking to, I guess. I mean, I think what NK was saying about speaking to like a close friend, or like that produces like the most intimate radio. And so sometimes I did think that I was like being a little bit too aware of the audience.
I was going to say that I feel like I'm sure Caitlin would have loved for me to consider audience more in making my series, but I think that I did think, I mean, what you said is true. Like the fact that they had an established audience, like definitely informed certain aspects of it, not with Divesting, but with subsequent episodes. But with like Divesting, I kind of approach it with Bitch Face, or like I approached my own writing before, where I just want to make the thing I want to make, and I really trust that the audience is there. And then I also happen to know the people that I do know in radio oftentimes are people who are like radio producers and artists, like they have some other kind of art practice. And so I think of those people, if anyone, as like the people I'm making work for, and like those people are making things that I really want to hear and like want to hear more of. And even at my like more like corporate job now, I still feel like you hired me, I'm going to do the thing that I've been doing. Like, like you presumably heard Bitch Face and The Heart, that's why you hired me. It's like, I'm not gonna, there was like an urge to like subsume myself and like, oh, this needs to sound a certain way or have a certain point of view. I'm just kind of like, I'm just going to do me everywhere I go, hopefully. Or like, I would only want to be in a place that would allow me to do the things that I want to do and the things I find interesting.
We've talked a lot about trusting the listener and kind of like not playing too much. Cause I think a lot of radio storytelling, like there are these rules that like assume a lot about the listener. And I feel like we're interested in making things that like trust that the listener is going to like come to where you are, that they like want to be taken somewhere maybe new or unexpected, and or things like that, versus kind of being like, you need to tell the listener this, like there's a lot of talk about the listener like in making radio, and I think we're interested in playing with that or upending that.
Nicole, you said you're working on a more newsy show. Can you talk about how you bring yourself, how does kind of your own aesthetic impact the work you're doing for like a newsy show?
The show that I'm on, it's Vice Audio has all these like new news shows, and I'm on like the least newsy one. Like I was like, I don't really have a lot of reporting experience. I don't think of myself as a journalist. So the show that I'm on is really just working. A lot of it, I think, has to do with just like I interview people, but I think a lot of my point of view comes across in the way that I cut tape. I'm also working with another sound designer for the first time. So I don't do a lot of sound design, but I think the way that I construct stories, we also have collective editing sessions. And so in one, someone said like, oh, I didn't really understand at first, but by the end I understood whatever. And like, that's kind of, I feel like that's how I write fiction. And so I trust that a certain kind of listener is going to be like, oh, I don't really know where this is going, but I'm so interested. I'm going to keep going with you. And I will wind up somewhere that feels surprising. Sometimes I will receive editorial feedback from there's only one other producer, and we have really different styles. And his is more of like a sort of like streamlined narrative. And a lot of times I will incorporate some of what he says, but I like leave in those like little weirdo parts that I feel like are like, no, like I think this should be here. Like it's a little bit of a divergence. It feels like a tangent, but it really isn't. I also like wanted to work on the show because I also wanted to have a lot more, I wanted some experience doing more, having to adhere to more stringent like story with material that I don't feel as like personally invested in. I'm invested in the stories I'm doing, but I don't feel, it's not about me is what I mean, I think. And it also I don't feel like it's part of like my like artistic oeuvre or something.
I feel like one thing that both of you do really well is like trusting the listener to kind of go be with you on this journey. And it's like not in a traditional linear format that we're used to hearing, but it does work. There's another question, just any audio/artist folks you love and recommend we should listen to?
I will say a new episode of The Heart came out today, made by one of our close collaborators and friends, Ariel Mejia.
And the next episode also is another one of our good friends who we've gone on retreats with and collaborated with, Mara Laser.
There's also like, I don't know if y'all know of like this thing that just happened at the Barbican Sound House. It's like these curated rooms of audio. There's some of our stuff in there. I feel like it's like a roster of a lot of the artists that I'm like excited to hear. Like what's their new stuff? Like what's coming out?
It's like Axel, James T. Green, Chiquita Pascal.
We're almost out of time, but what are you two working on now that you're excited about?
I'm writing pitches for shows. I want to make a fictional show. So I'm trying to come up with shows that feel something like Bitch Face, but maybe incorporating some of the things that The Heart taught me. But Appearances that also came out from Mermaid Palace was just like, I think is really amazing by Sharon Mashihi. It's like really amazing radio. And so I think I have a goal that I'm like, I want to make something that feels it's a 6-episode series. And I think it's really well done. And she worked on it for 3 years. So I think like Divesting, I worked on it for like 6 months. I would love to work on something for 3 years.
I'm doing a job where I'm not me. I'm like a SpawnCon audio bot. So I won't recommend that, but I mean, you know, I get my point of view in there when I can, but I've done like oral history with this group, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project in LA, or they're based in the Bay, and they have a group in New York, and I'm working on a podcast that's supposed to maybe happen next year with some people there that's like about eviction and technology and the relationship between like property and the state that goes back really far and how it manifests today. That's like a thing that I'm working on. I'm excited about.
And we might collab again. I feel like because of The Heart, we haven't even had time to like think about it or talk about it. But
once the next year starts, I'm sure there will be some more PUNK to come.
Yeah, for sure. I miss Bitch Face.
I look forward to hearing it. Thank you both so much. This conversation.
Thanks you all.
Was excellent. If people haven't listened to the entirety of Race Trader and Divesting from People Pleasing, you really should, because they're incredible.